please, let's begin by you stating your name and telling us where you were born and where you grew up.
Sure. So my name is Ralph Mastromonaco, and I was born in Montreal. And I grew up as a son of Italian immigrants. We first started living in NDG. So we lived in an apartment below the tracks, as they called, near St. Raymond's Parish. And then by dint of determination, when my parents were able to buy their first home, we moved above the tracks to NDG, and we lived on a home on Walkley Avenue between Summerled and Fielding. And we stayed there a good many years until about 1966, when we moved uptown. We needed, there was a third addition to our family, and we needed more space. My younger brother was about to be born, so we needed more space. So my parents moved up to the Nouveau Bordeaux area, and I lived there just up until I married and left home. So I'm born and raised in Montreal.
Thank you. So we're going to discuss about your roles in the school boards over the years. So what were your roles at the school boards, and which boards?
Okay. Sure. Well, first of all, I attribute a lot of whatever success I've had in life to the education that I received in Montreal. And to me, I always carried a debt of honor to the educational system, commencing with the English Catholic public school system, on to CEGEP, on to McGill University. And there's no question in my mind that whatever success or good fortune I've had in my life, in large part, came from my education. So when my kids came of school age, I made the decision to get involved in their education so that they get the signal that it's really important. And I started as a member of the school committee. And quickly from there, I was encouraged to become a school commissioner, an elected school commissioner, so I could represent parents at the school board. And I was a school commissioner with the Baldwin-Cartier School Board from 1989 to 1998. It was a very exciting time of the year. Those years were very exciting because by 1998, we transitioned from our confessional school system to what we have today, which is our linguistic board system. And I was privileged to be the first provisional chairman of what came to be known as the Lester B. Pearson School Board. So I was very active in those 9 years and enjoyed my time at the school board, meeting with parents, meeting with teachers, principals, educators at large. And you know, I think that I wanted to make a contribution to the education system. I learned a lot, and I think I contributed quite a bit. And I think my kids got the message that the school is an important place. Schooling is important and something that we need to be successful at. And I think my wife and I achieved that.
Wonderful. So you say you were an elected commissioner.
Right.
So is that position, is that a paid position, or how does that work?
Okay. So it was paid, and they called what they paid you a stipend, which is neither a salary nor anything significant. At the time, I think I was paid something in the order of $3,000 a year. So it was really a volunteer position. And then when I was appointed to the executive committee, they added on another $2,000. So at the zenith, I was earning maybe $5,000 a year for, I don't want to know how many hours of work, how many meetings and committees I sat on. It was just amazing. So nobody did that for the money.
Was there other work? Like, you were an elected commissioner, yes, but was there other work related to your participation in the school boards as well?
Not really. What was really important for a school commissioner is that you were elected by parents. So my position always was that I was there, elected by parents, and I answered to the needs of the parents and their students and their children. So that required us to, we set up a number of committees. I was on a number of committees while I was at the school board, and that required time. Also, at all of our monthly meetings, the public monthly meetings and the executive meetings, there was massive amounts of documents that were generated by the by the Director General of the board and the various departments. And we dealt with everything from, you know, repairing buildings, to pedagogical issues, to disciplinary issues. It was a broad mix of items that came before us. We needed to sometimes discipline students for bad behavior. We sometimes needed to get involved with problematic teachers, and everything, the gamut of running a really big organization.
Thank you. Do you consider working for boards a form of community organizing or a form of activism? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think you could engage in some really important activism on the school boards because, especially for where we are now with the English-speaking school boards, the English school boards are the only institutions that English-speaking people in Quebec actually control and manage, where their children can go and see themselves in their classmates and see themselves in the teaching body and in the curriculum. So it is really important in terms of getting involved there. And certainly if you're concerned with pedagogical issues and what are the best ways to teach our kids anything from math to ethics to history, that's where you want to be. But I have to also say that it is not an easy thing as an elected official. You do encounter resistance. Certainly if you come to a board with a lot of ideas and you want to change things, I've noticed in my experience there's a great inertia on the part of administrators, let's call them bureaucrats, which is what they are. They're there to run the day-to-day operations of the school board. So there's always a bit of maybe rivalry is the wrong word, but there's always a bit of a tension when the elected people want to initiate something. Very often we use the phrase that, the Council of Commissioners was treated as a rubber stamping body. And many times it was, because we were not going to get into the minutiae of which contractor should repair a roof on such and such a school. We had a bidding process involved. We had an engineer that was our director of material resources, and we trust that person to tell us this is the right person that should do that job. But when you get into other areas where perhaps the Council of Commissioners do have expertise in certain areas. There were a number of Council of Commissioners who were teachers, for example, from other school boards that were qualified to run and so on. And that gets a little bit more problematic because, the assumption is, well, this is what we do day to day, we know more than you. That sometimes could get into a bit of an issue. But I think if you, in committee, that's what committee work is all about, where new ideas should be able to be encouraged, perhaps modified, but that we get a sense of the possibility of renewal. And one of the things I say in a lot of the social media that I do is that the Quebec education system is in dire need of being reimagined.
Would you say, so what about the activism part? Would you say that in the community organizing,
yes,
there's also a form of activism?
Yes, I think there is activism, and I think it's legitimate because, when somebody engages in activism, the person is basically advocating for someone and for something. And it's very easy to dismiss people's ideas by gaslighting them and telling them that, oh, you're really a militant, your idea is radical, rather than just address the actual idea. And that's the big problem. So there's a very important skill you need to develop in terms of defining what you want to change, defining what you think is wrong, and then in a very diplomatic manner, convincing the decision makers that we need to make a change. To get that done, you need support. In order to get support, you need to engage in activism. You need to get people to listen to your ideas and to say, yes, that's a good idea. We'll follow that. We'll support you, and we'll come to the next school board meeting. And no matter what it is, it could be changing a bus route. It could be changing some of the curriculum. It could be introducing a new extracurricular activity, something that will make student life better. And You know, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm really used to the word no. But that never deters me, because I like to say to the younger lawyers, every case you win starts with an adverse party saying no to you. But eventually, you know, if you believe in your ideas and you engage in principled perseverance, you will achieve that. And you won't achieve it for yourself. That's very important too, that what you are trying to do is to make life better for others.
Thank you. Tell us about your experience of being excluded from French language schools.
Oh, sure. Well, I have a really clear recollection of the day my mom brought me to a school with my older brother to enroll us. And at the risk of betraying my age, it was 1962. And I recall that in that academic year, my mom brought my brother and myself to the closest school to the home. And I'll address that point. And, you know, when we got there, I recall the principal coming out and saying to my mother, you know, realizing right away that she was an Italian immigrant, she said, well, you're an Italian immigrant, you know, you should be going to the English school. And that English school was St. Monica's in NDG. Now, much was written in the ensuing years about the motivation of Italian immigrant parents in terms of sending their kids to English school as opposed to French school. And I've made this point in other forums that I could attest and confirm to everybody watching this interview that the only calculus that my mother engaged in at the time was which was a closer school to our home, and she wanted me to get to school and back as quickly as possible, and she absolutely wanted me to avoid the intersection at Cavendish and Summerled, which was a busy intersection then, and it's a busy intersection today. So I can tell you that my mom barely spoke French or English. It was the early years of their immigrant experience, and they were focused on survival and making a living and paying bills, getting their kids to school and back, getting supper ready, and all of those things. There was absolutely no consideration of politics, of what would be better for my son in terms of his future career. None of that was in her universe of thought. And yet I was told, go to St. Monica's. And so for my parents, well, that's, you know, they always respect people in authority. They're not going to contest or have an argument with the principal or anything like that. And that's what we did. So my educational journey was put on a completely different trajectory. And I enrolled at St. Monica's and stayed there until we moved and remained within the English Catholic system until I graduated from law school at McGill University.
Do you have, what is your personal recollection as a child of having this access refused, and can you explain it today?
Well, actually, I mean, I have no recollection of it impacting me emotionally in any way whatsoever. And as I said in other interviews, that I carry no victim complex over it. And as a child, you just go where your mom tells you to go. And if an adult says you're going to go to another school, well, that's what you did. So, but obviously, as I got older, and because I had such a great interest in politics and law and that kind of thing, you know, I did start to hear this narrative, particularly after the St. Leonard riots, that certain Francophones were really angry at the Italian community for sending their kids to, you know, English school. And I found that really, really peculiar, to say the least, you know, because many of us remember that, well, we tried to go and we were categorically rejected from that choice. And we were directed to the English schools by Francophones. So what's this narrative all about? That now all of a sudden, you know, we're being blamed. So the double injustice of this whole narrative was that initially we were rejected from the Francophone schools, and there were reasons for that at the time. namely that we were different. We did not fit in the homogeneous classes of the time that were predominantly Francophone students whose names and roots could be traced back to the original settler society of Quebec, New France. And also there was, Quebec society had the highest birth rate in the Western world. There was no demographic imperative at the time. They did not need, the French-speaking school system did not need demographic reinforcement from immigrants. So immigrants were still perceived as different, and why do we need to educate these students who are probably harder to teach? Because many of us, not myself, but many of us arrived there without speaking Italian. So there was no idea of classe d'accueil. None of that existed at the time. So if you ask me, like, how did it impact on me? It impacted on me afterwards. When I started hearing this narrative, I saw the utter hypocrisy of it. And we basically let it go. Maybe we shouldn't have, but we seem to have just let the louder voices speak. And that's where I really started to reflect on the injustice of it all.
So, particularly, how did this experience of exclusion impact the work that, hold on, yes, impact the work that you are doing today?
Oh,
yeah.
Well,
particularly in the leading movement to seek an apology for the people not allowed to attend English school at the time.
Well, I think what motivates this movement, if you like, or this advocacy work is something I've been wanting to do for a while, but I became particularly concerned with the present government in power and the narratives that are being, that continue to be propagated by a certain propaganda machine, and that's all I'm going to call it, because it doesn't deserve to be called journalism, because it's not. Because credible journalism does fact checking and seeks to tell an accurate story of what happened, who was there, and why did it happen. And when it comes to the Italian immigrant experience, that's totally lacking. And particularly after the passage of Bill 96, and when I really studied it from a human rights perspective and a legal perspective, it became very clear to me that this legislation is not about enhancing the vitality of the French language, and it's all about diminishing the presence of the English-speaking community and the English-speaking language. It's an attempt to rewrite history, and it's an attempt to implement a vision of Quebec that never was and never should be, in my humble opinion. So that movement and these kind of language and identity politics rely on what I call false narratives. And this is one of them. There are others that I intend to address going forward in the next 2 years prior to the next election. But this one, I think, is very critical to be considered in today's world. It's not just something I think is of a historical interest, because to this day, politicians engage in immigrant blaming and immigrant bashing for many social problems. So, for example, the policies that seek to enhance the French language, or if we're talking about why do we have a problem with the French language, or a presumed problem with the French language, the topic of immigration will always come up. Do we have too many immigrants? Should we have more immigrants? When these immigrants come, what language do they come speaking? How fast does it take for them to learn French? And what do they speak at home? I think there's a level of political inquiry that I think crosses a line right now. And the idea of immigrant blaming started with the Italian community. The genesis of the language issue and the turmoil, the social turmoil surrounding it happened in 1968-69 with the St. Leonard riots. Those riots provoked the Union Nationale government of the time, M. Bertrand, to appoint the Gendron Commission. And that commission engaged in an extensive inquiry that produced a report of some 1,400 pages. And M. Bertrand didn't even wait for the report to implement Bill 22. And ironically, this nationalist government enacted freedom of choice as a response of all things. And why? Because a conservative leaning government at that time believed in personal freedom and that parents should decide what language their children should be educated in. At the same time, M. Bertrand said, yes, but of course we should, at the same time, try to improve the presence of French in our public spaces and the quality of the French language spoken. And after that, obviously, we know that Robert Bourassa in the Liberal Party adopted language legislation as well. Excuse me, Bertrand was Bill 63. It was Bourassa that
Bill 22.
That passed Bill 22 that established French as the official language of the province of Quebec. And of course, in 1977, the PQ government changed that to the charter of the French language that we've lived under since that time. So, but if you go back to it, the trigger was there were too many Italian parents sending their kids to English school in the school board at the time, located in St. Leonard, and it created a lot of social upheaval. And there was a lot of other social upheaval going down by a terrorist organization called the FLQ, which is what it was, because it was setting off bombs all over Montreal and targeting a lot of federal institutions, mailboxes, post offices, companies with English names. So there was an awful lot of turmoil going around at that time.
Perfect. I missed a question.
Sure.
I just want to backtrack and
Sure.
then come back to this because we haven't talked about why an apology is important.
Oh.
But prior to that, for you, so we talked about the experience of exclusion.
Right.
But I wanted to know how this experience of exclusion, calling it today, had an impact or impacted your work in the English school boards, for example, or
Okay.
in English language education in Quebec.
All right. Okay. So yeah. So I can't say that the exclusion that occurred in my past impacted the work I did at the school board. The interesting thing that I recall is that when you worked, the denominational schools at the time were run by school boards that again were organized along religious lines. So we had a French Catholic school board called Baldwin-Cartier School Commission, and there was an English section of English Catholic parents that had basically a network of English Catholic schools. But the Council of Commissioners were mixed. They were French-speaking parents and English-speaking parents that ran for office, and it provided a wonderful opportunity for English and French-speaking people to work together because they were united in one thing, and that is getting the best education for their kids. And I always say that the most honest discussions that you will get are from parents talking about their kids and what they want for their kids. And there's very little difference between what a Francophone parent wants and what an Anglophone parent wants for their children. And the most important thing they want is they want them to achieve their potential. That's number one. And they absolutely want their kids to have a positive school experience. And in my experience as a lawyer, defending people that are young people that sometimes get involved in problems with the law and so on, the common denominator is a very bad school experience. And I often say this, that there's an emotional prerequisite to learning, and a child must feel good about himself or herself. And we need to provide a great learning environment for them. And so I think that that's what united us at the school board. So yes, political issues, it's really funny that how we tended to avoid going there. We always tried to stay focused on what's our job here. Our job here is to get the best education for our kids. And I do recall sometimes having the odd conversation about this and saying, well, in my time, we were excluded from the French Catholic schools, and many couldn't believe it. They never heard this story, and they said, no, that can't be. No, it really did happen. And we also got into the funniest conversations because at Baldwin-Cartier, we had a very strong immersion program, a French immersion program. And I have to say that for the 9 years I was there, I could affirm unequivocally that the #1 pedagogical concern of Anglophone parents was learning French, that their kids had to master the French language. And their level of proficiency was they need to be able to get a job in Quebec. I don't care what they do for a living, but they need to be able to carry on a conversation, to be able to write reports, and can you do that for us? And we were completely focused on that, and it was always about more French content. We always enhanced it. And the odd time we would get parents saying, well, why can't we do that in the French section? And I said, well, you'll need to talk to your politicians about that. And we would gingerly avoid that conversation. So I think, Anita, that I was guilty of complacency about what happened in the 50s and the 60s. And also, a lot of us kids growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s heeded our parents' advice. And our parents' advice was, there is this thing going on in Quebec about French and English. How about you stay out of it and you just learn both languages? And that was tremendously good advice. And many of us, I could hardly find an Italian origin kid of my generation that doesn't speak 3 languages. So we basically stayed focused on learning both languages and making a life for ourselves. And we were able to navigate all of these language issues. And I was able to do that through the October crisis, through the election of the PQ, through 2 divisive referendums that accomplished nothing as far as I'm concerned, except setting us back. And so we basically, I'm not going to say we suffered in silence, but we kept the issue to ourselves. And with what's going on now, I made the decision that it's time for me to engage in some advocacy because regrettably our politicians are failing us miserably. Even the ones that are supposed to be representing English-speaking electorate. And I said it's time for an uprising of common sense, is what I refer to it. And so for years, I was focused on my career, on raising our 3 kids, making sure that they became bilingual, making sure that they were able to launch careers in Quebec. And I check off those boxes. I'm very proud of that. And today we have 7 grandkids, and now I'm concerned about them. You know, I really am. I'm not being dramatic, because there's a vision that's being espoused that I think is completely inconsistent with Quebec history and completely ill-advised for our future. So it's time for us to advocate. And let's start at the beginning, is how I felt about this, which is why I wrote these articles in the Suburban and La Presse, to say that this language issue started with a false narrative, but it's time to challenge it. And I'm very fond of saying that Quebec belongs to everybody, that every voice matters and every voice merits being heard. And even though one voice may be louder, doesn't make it more right. So there is a certain vision that people and political parties are trying to promote, and they have every right to do that. We live in a democracy, and we need to accept democratic results. But that democracy also means that if you have an alternative vision for our society, you're entitled to express it as loud as the other opinion. I hope that we can have a lower toned conversation. I talk about a dispassionate, truthful conversation about where have we come from and where do we need to be going.
Is this what propelled also the need to tell history as it is?
Yes.
This is what propelled the town hall that you organized?
Absolutely, absolutely. I sensed, once I wrote the article, once I wrote the article.
And just for context, can you explain what article you're referring to?
Oh yes, okay. So I wrote an article called First in English, and it was entitled History. It was entitled "Time Does Not Erase History, Nor Silence Injustice," and it talks of and the subject was the exclusion of Italian immigrant children from the French Catholic school system at the time. And then a lot of people said, well, you're preaching to the converted. Why don't you do this in the French press? And I wrote a French version of that article, and it was published in La Presse. And it was entitled La communauté italienne et la question de la langue. And that article garnered me some 60,000 impressions on LinkedIn, and by their metrics, it constitutes going viral, a few hundred likes and many, many comments. And it got a lot of, I got a lot of positive feedback, and I fine-tuned my what I said last night in terms of the reaction to that article, and there were actually 3 reactions. And the first one was, "Thank you, Ralph, for writing this article, because this happened to me as well. We never talked about it, and thank you for finally bringing it to light and shining a light on me." And I was getting people, you know, I was living in St. Leonard, this happened, I was living in Villemard, I was living in Rosemount, we were living in NDG, and a lot of people were telling me, yeah, thank you for finally bringing this. We tried to talk about this with the Francophone colleagues at work or cohorts at school, and they didn't believe it, or they didn't hear about it, and so on. And then, of course, I got younger generation Italian Canadians that basically said, thank you for telling this story, because I never knew about it. And I said, of course you didn't know about it. It was never reported in the media, and it was never taught to you in our school curriculum. How would you possibly know about it? Some of them may have heard it from their parents and grandparents, but a lot of people didn't know. But there was a third reaction, and the third reaction was total silence. And by that I mean, you would think that writing such an article in the French press, which with so many professional commentariat out there that earn a living writing about the language issue, particularly the constant threat to the French language, and who have made a career out of this for decades, to read a story like this. And I was expecting an academic challenge. I was expecting somebody to come back and say whatever, but I got silence. And that silence is telling, because that indicates to me that there was nothing factually inaccurate in what I wrote in that article, and that it couldn't be challenged. So these professional journalists will continue to talk about that false narrative and pretend that what I said didn't happen, or what I said wasn't written. And that's why I called for the town hall. And I said to myself, well, let's have a meeting and let's see if people will show up. And we had a really very successful town hall. Lots of people showed up. It was a full house. And after making some brief comments, we turned the mic to the audience. That was the purpose of that meeting. And we wanted to hear their oral histories. And they eagerly took the mic and talked about their oral histories. And I found it a very touching exercise in empathy and solidarity, because even if you didn't take the mic, you listened. And that's very important. And we can't trivialize what occurred, because it was symptomatic of a lot of other prejudice and discrimination that our parents and grandparents encountered when they immigrated here. And it was almost therapeutic for these audience members to talk about it, and said, you know, for decades, this was never offered to us, a forum to come and just share that experience. And I felt it really moving. It was a very moving evening. And that led to the final questions, what's next? And to me, it's very clear what's next. And what's next is this needs to be debated and discussed in the public domain. And that public domain, first and foremost, is the Quebec National Assembly. And ultimately, I believe that we need to take a different look at history. And I really feel that the history curriculum of our Quebec education system is frankly an embarrassment. I believe it's white Eurocentric focused. It doesn't tell a lot of the stories that need to be told. We have nothing in our curriculum about Indigenous people that were here before. We're too focused on the English and French colonialism of this territory. We don't talk about race or the fact that slavery existed until about 1834 when it was abolished. None of that is mentioned, or the immigrant contribution to what we know as Quebec today. All of that is completely absent. We're not at the table, and that's wrong. So I really think that this is the beginning of, I hope, creating a more inclusive and diverse Quebec, and one that cares about social justice. So for me to bring this up, and I said we will approach this in baby steps, and we will get things going. And at the end of the meeting, I asked, are there people interested in working with us on this? And I got a good number of people signing up that claim that, yeah, we need to pursue this further. And I think as a democracy, it's really important. If we are a democratic society committed to human rights, I think we need to embrace all of our history. Yes, I think Canada is the greatest country in the world. At the same time, I acknowledge that my whole Canadian experience has been lived out in Quebec. So I love Quebec as well. My voice matters. And because I love Quebec, I think we need to celebrate our accomplishments, but also be critical of our failings, of our shortcomings, of the past, and to make sure that they don't get repeated. And the first step in that healing process is to acknowledge a wrong that occurred. And after that, to do what we do in our everyday lives as human beings, we apologize for conduct that was less becoming, let's say. So this is what's motivating me now. And I think that whenever you advocate for something, you need to be ready for the long game. And you need to be prepared to practice principled persistence. And that's what I think. I think there's a groundswell of support for that.
So this is why you think the government needs to apologize to the Italian and other minority communities?
Yes, that's a very good point. And the thing that I also want to stress is that I'm very well aware that our story is not unique. We were not the only class of Quebec residents who were excluded. Clearly, the Jewish community was completely excluded from the French education system of the 50s and 60s, as well as other non-Catholics. So anybody not Catholic, by definition, was excluded by the education system that existed at that time. And I think it's important for people who are studying this today to realize that this is not a value judgment of who we are today, but I think we need to look at who we were 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and has that impacted on our historical progression? And it did. And I don't want to put the experience of the Italian immigrants in the same category as what occurred to Indigenous people or to racialized persons in our society. Absolutely not. But there are analogies. There are analogies. And the exercise we're going through with the Indigenous and the racialized communities are very much focused on acknowledging the wrongs of the past, apologizing in the present, and building on that to create a better future for everyone.
So, and how does your story link to that of English-speaking community organizing? And in which way do you consider yourself part of the English-speaking community? Well,
I obviously consider myself part of the English-speaking community because although Italian was my mother tongue in terms of the first language I learned as a child and continue to speak, my language of instruction was English. But the problem that we have in Quebec is that there are all kinds of assumptions that are drawn from the fact that I went to English school my whole life. And the wrong stereotype and myth that's built, that's been propagated, is that somehow I rejected the French language, or that I was not concerned, or that if I'm part of the English-speaking community, how could I possibly be sympathetic to or supportive of the French-speaking community? And that, to me, is very narrow-minded, binary thinking, because I don't define myself as exclusively French-speaking, English-speaking, or French-speaking. And I really, really abhor that false choice that just about everybody in Quebec is given, as though there's a litmus test to who's a real Quebecer. And I really challenge the purported right of certain political movements, notably the separatist nationalist movements, who claim some sort of monopoly on defining Quebec authenticity. And I think that needs to change, because Quebec does not belong to one ethnicity or one language group. The history of Quebec is the history of a collaboration of two predominant language groups, which is French-speaking and English-speaking. And the contribution of others speaking other languages, practicing other faiths other than Christianity, that have contributed to the Quebec that we know of as today. So I really challenge that. And going forward, you know, we will become demographically a more diverse population. And the French language will mean different things to different people. And we're in a democracy, and that's okay. So when you say you're organizing, or do you feel attached to the English-speaking community? Of course I am. But that English-speaking community has evolved over the last 50 years. And we are not what we were in the 1970s. But I believe, for political reasons, that there are political parties and politicians who are stuck in the past, because that narrative serves their ultimate purpose. Their ultimate purpose is to create a unilingual French-speaking society with absolute jurisdiction, and to break from Canadian federalism, and to create this society that never was. I'll repeat that again. And I'm here to say that, as an English-speaking person, I knew very early in my life that I needed to acquire French language proficiency, and I desperately wanted that. And unfortunately, the English-speaking education system at the time was woefully inadequate. But a few parents in the South Shore thought up the idea of French immersion in 1962. And that idea happened before the FLQ, before the PQ, before Bill 101. English-speaking parents realized that it was really important to learn the French language. So they were committed to the French language. And my generation of parents absolutely wanted that, knew that. When I was going through English schools, it was terribly taught. And I'll never forget that I took courses at CEGEP at Vanier College. And the Francophone teacher that was teaching me French was from Alberta. He was a Francophone Albertan. And we talked one day after class how I told him I wanted to become a lawyer, and it was really important for me to learn French. I was really motivated to do that. And the thing he told me was, stop taking French courses. He told me that. I'll never forget him. I wish I could remember his name. And he said, you've been taught very badly. Your will is there. The only thing that'll work for you is immersion. And it happened, because I had to get a job to finance my university studies, and I started to work in a Francophone environment. I'll never forget the first manager when I went to the interview, who performed an incredible act of kindness, and he said to me, well, how's your French? And I said, well, yeah, I speak French, but not very good. And he said, well, you'll learn with us. And I think that was one of the greatest acts of kindness that I ever had in my life. He hired me on the spot, and I worked at that job for 8 years, and he was right. I learned a lot of French. So by the time I went through university, through law school at that job. And by the time I hit law school, I articled at a firm, and French was really important. And again, the acts of kindness were unbelievable. I was unsteady on my feet in the French language, but I wanted to be a litigator of all things, which means you go to court and plead in French and represent French clients. And I can't tell you how many times judges and opposing counsel gave me a bye on all the grammatical errors that I was making, or corrected my French and switched to English sometimes. I didn't even ask for that. So when I went up to Joliette and Saint-Jérôme and Trois-Rivières, I was so well received. In fact, they almost wanted to touch me and say, wow, you're an Italian Anglophone. Hey, you know, I've been to Italy as well. So, you know, this is the Quebec that I knew. So when my kids hit school age, they were going to be in an immersion program. They felt comfortable because they saw themselves in the classes, but they were taught by Francophone teachers, first language Francophone teachers, and they did remarkably well. And as a commissioner, I heard it ad nauseum. More French, more French. And so this is why I'm so disappointed with the level of conversation we continue to have, as though we are still, the unilingual Anglophone community of the 1950s and 60s, who were the bosses, who refused to intermingle with the French-speaking community, that rejected French, that considered the French language and people inferior. Right now, I really have gone to another level and find that conversation, in fact, insulting to our community. And I think they need to get to know us better.
And so that begs my next question. So how did your relationship with the Francophone majority change over the years?
Yeah, well, that was incredible. My experience with the Francophone majority, be it the summer jobs and part-time jobs that I held through my university years and then into the collegial relationships I had with lawyers, was that it was always very civil, very respectful. We had a lot of mutual respect for one another, and that I was valued. I was accepted for who I was. As much as I tried, my accent would sometimes come through. Grammatical errors would happen, errors of syntax could happen, but it got better. It got better. And it got to the point where I think the most important and most gratifying thing that happened to me in my career were unilingual Francophones that hired me to defend them in court. And they knew very well that I was not a Francophone de souche. They knew that by my name. My name gave it away right away. The linguistic slip-ups that came up in our discussions, but they felt that I was the guy they wanted in the court, and I was incredibly honored by that. So, when I see this cacophony going on, it sort of outrages me, because that's not the real Quebec. That's not the Quebec that I had. So. I may watch less French TV and I may watch a little bit too much American TV when I have time to actually watch TV, but I'm completely invested in the Francophone fact, and most of the English-speaking community understands the why of language education and the need for it, and empathize, I think would be the right word, with that concern of Francophones who care about their future and want to preserve the vitality of the French language.
Any thoughts about Alliance Quebec or the Quebec Community Groups Network?
I think they do important work. I really do. It's very, as a community, we need to value what everybody does and the contributions that they're making. And again, we're on the same page. I think all of Alliance Quebec and the community group, the problem that I see is they're perceived as adversaries, and that's wrong. Because as I'm fond of saying, we come in peace. We welcome dialogue. we understand and empathize with the cause of promoting the French language. But I also think that we get more with honey than vinegar. And I think that the approach is completely wrong. What's going on today, I have no problem in saying it's completely the wrong approach. And I'm fond of saying that none of us doubt, us being those that identify with the English-speaking community, none of us question the why of language education. Our issue is with the how. And that's a message that I think we need to express to and engage the French-speaking majority, and not necessarily the politicians, because I think many of them are doing an awful job of representing the true concerns of francophones, quite frankly. So those groups do a lot of great work in terms of they do research. Most of their arguments are backed by statistics, by social science data, and I think their concern is with building a future for their children and grandchildren. So that's admirable work. But I think there's also different paths to that goal. I think we're all united in a goal of building a better Quebec. My definition of a better Quebec is a Quebec that is more inclusive, more diverse, and that puts human rights front and center. And all of this to achieve what? To allow every individual living here to achieve their potential and to pursue their best life possible and to be their authentic selves.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to go back to the role that you had at the school boards. Can you tell us about the switch from the denominational to linguistic school boards?
Sure.
Who's behind promoting the idea? Did it come from the government, the community? Was there opposition?
Okay. Well, the idea of modernizing our school boards had percolated for a decade or two, to be honest, okay? And as the Quebec society progressed, the inconsistency of having a school system based on religious faith at a time where fewer and fewer people actually practiced that faith, the utter hypocrisy of that was very well known to many people in the English and French-speaking community. And the rise of the importance of language rather than religion, I think, took off from the early 70s, if not the 60s, with the Quiet Revolution, with urbanization, and with the waning of the importance of the church and religion in our daily lives and in our daily choices. It didn't take long for us to realize that this system is inconsistent with the society that we have. And also, what was important is with the passage of human rights legislation, with the Quebec Charter of Rights, in fact, being enacted in 1975, well before the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms that came with the patriation of our Constitution in 1982, and the different movements dealing with equality, rights of equality, and the place of language in our society. It obviously came to a head with the PQ government of 94 to 98, and the PQ government finally had the political will to move in that direction. And Madame Marois, Pauline Marois, was the education minister who championed that file, and she did a remarkable job, actually, of getting that done. The previous Liberal government had felt that there was still resistance from the Catholic Church, from the Catholic lobby, and was reluctant to go there. And I give the PQ government credit for going there, and did the English-speaking community a huge service by creating an important institution for us, which was an English language school board. And we created the French language school board. And as with language legislation that started in 1977, French Catholic schools stopped being Catholic because they now had to accept all immigrants coming from all over the world of different races and who practice different faiths. It was completely ridiculous to have a French Catholic school anymore, and they saw that. And what that ended up happening is that the Protestant school boards were opening French schools to receive this clientele.
Oh, I just got a personal answer. So then why would you explain it took so long, right? So there's the legislation, so there's the Quiet Revolution in the late 60s, beginning 70s.
Yes.
The legislation, Bill 101 passes in 1977. Why did it take that long to actually complete, for the schools to not be managed by religious
well,
heads?
they were not managed anymore. That happened with the establishment of the Department of Education after the Pearson Commission. We established civil administration of schools and hospitals, by the way. And your question is very good. I mean, I think that in fairness, once you pass this language legislation, you do need a few years to get your bearings with it and to see how is this legislation now going to affect school populations. And with that comes curriculum considerations as well. How do you accommodate non-Catholics when they had come to a French Catholic school and they want to opt out of religious instruction? You have to respect the parents' wishes to not be part of that. And it becomes cumbersome. And that became more and more cumbersome over the years. And I think that government, all politicians realize that this needs to change. We're unique in North America. You know, the idea of a public school accepting children of all faiths was the North American norm. So what are we still doing here in Quebec with this parochial system that is completely inconsistent with our demographics? And that's when the wheels started turning. And it took till about maybe 94 that the first legislation was adopted, and then 97, 98. I have to say, I was in the thick of that movement at the time, and I was in the thick of the conversion of denominational schools into these linguistic boards, and it involved transferring, I called it the 3 Ps, which was personnel, property, and pedagogy. So we had to merge and extract all of the school networks and realign them into English and French. And that was done remarkably well, in my opinion. And there was another thing that we needed that isn't talked about at all. We needed a constitutional amendment to achieve that, because confessional school boards were constitutionally protected by the 1867 BNA Act, and it wasn't touched by the 1982 repatriation. So we needed to handle that with a constitutional amendment. And that passed under the radar, undetected. That was done in no time. Quebec and the federal government immediately passed the necessary constitutional amendment to allow this to happen. And it was the Bouchard government at the time. Nobody bothers to give federalism, credit for that, but it absolutely facilitated one of the most important changes to the most important institution in Quebec society, which is our education system. I never get tired of saying, while I was a commissioner, I was very fond of saying that after a child's home, his school or her school is the most important place in that child's life. And besides their parents, the teachers and principals that interact with our kids every day are the most important people in their lives in terms of formative people. So to make this change is very important, and the English-speaking community achieved an important result, and that is to have that school system under our management and control.
Were you involved in attempting to integrate minority language issues in curriculum at all? Or?
Well, curriculum is a very difficult subject for a commissioner to actually impact on. I find that the Ministry of Education at the time was very much top-down. we always talked about how things were determined on Fulham Street, which was where the building of the Ministry of Education was housed. And every now and then we would be summoned as commissioners to listen to the Minister of Education. But I have to say that there was very little impact that a commissioner could have on curriculum. It was treated as something that only the professionals knew about. That was their domain, and thank you for your suggestions, but no, we're not going to talk about human rights and things of that nature. And it was always funny to see parents come to public meetings and say things like this, like, why aren't we teaching this in history? Why aren't we doing more of this in curriculum? Why don't we do home economics again in high school? Men and women should learn how to wash clothes and cook meals, and we were always sort of like trivialized. But I also have to say that teachers also felt disempowered. Teachers also felt powerless to do that. And my two daughters are both teachers, and they're very passionate about what they teach their students in their classroom. And teachers had a way of saying, there is an official Quebec history, but you know what, we throw in a little extra, and we manage through English literature, for example, to teach a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, so that we learn about prejudice and we learn about discrimination and so on. So I wish I could have had a bigger impact. But I really, do take to task our elected officials, because I think our Minister of Education needs to be that voice that doesn't just rubber stamp things, that actually goes into the ministry and says, we're going to switch things up, and talk to the deputy minister and the higher echelons of the bureaucracy to say, thanks, you've been doing this for 30, 40 years, but we need to switch this up. And I find that there's a lack of political will to do that. And not only in education, but in other areas as well. There's a complacency. And I got this as a minor league politician when I was a school commissioner, that, if you don't have your Director General on board with anything, it's not going to happen. But there comes a time when the elected people need to exert their authority, because ultimately, and according to the law, we are responsible for the board. We are supposed to tell you the orientation, and you are supposed to implement and execute the direction, because our power comes from the people, your power comes from us. And I think that that's really lacking in public policy today.
Well, do you think that the schools should be promoting English-speaking community identity somewhere, or other minority identities,
Yes,
such as Italian identity and history?
Absolutely. I think that our history curriculum is woefully inadequate. I've said this numerous times. And that inadequacy is both at in the English-speaking education system and the French-speaking education. I know I may be more critical of what's going on in the French-speaking system, because we've just announced the creation of a new museum. And again, it's very much the promotion of the French-speaking fact in Quebec. And I say, yes, celebrate that, but you're not alone. Also, the English-speaking community, our roots are in the conquest of 1763, for sure. The origin of the English-speaking community may have been Anglo-Saxon, but that's not what we are today. So even the English history curriculum, there's more to Quebec than language. There's more to Quebec than the Plains of Abraham, Confederation. The 1834 rebellion is inadequately taught. And then fast forward, so it's not all about Jacques Cartier, Champlain, the conquest. Fast forward to Confederation and the shortcomings of Confederation, but not the achievements of Confederation. And then fast forward to the Quiet Revolution, the October Crisis, and basically Quebec nationalism becomes the Quebec normal. And there are different perspectives on Canadian history and Quebec history that I believe are absolutely not taught. And that's wrong, because I believe we're failing our young children, and they need to wait till at least cégep or university to finally see that, oh, wait a minute, there were Indigenous people here, and I don't know anything about Indigenous rights, nothing about treaty rights. There was slavery in Quebec. There was the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act on August 1st of 1834. What was that all about? What was the rebellion really about, 1837 and 1838? Yes, there were certain linguistic undertones, but it was a fight for democracy. And it was the gradual path to the creation of something called Canada. So, and what is Canada? And what's Quebec's role in the Canadian creation and in the incredibly internationally respected success story that Canada is today? Quebec was an equal founding partner in that success story. Why aren't we hearing that? So I believe that it's fine to be proud of, the French fact, but I think we do a disservice to our children if we don't give them alternative opinions, alternative perspectives, and let them decide going forward. Why do they need to wait till cégep to finally hear a different version of Canadian and Quebec history?
Yes, indeed.
But this is what the English-speaking community, I think, is striving to do. And initiatives like Alliance Quebec and like the Community Group Association and this really great documentary that was done by Guy Rex Rogers about what we choose to believe is the beginning, I think, of an important turnaround, I think, where we as a community say, we've been carpet bombed with myths and stereotypes about ourselves for a long, long time. And we need a wake-up call to say, well, we live in a democracy. We're entitled to express an alternate view of ourselves, and we're starting to do that. And I'm really proud of that, and I think I'm part of that. My biggest goal is to spark an initiative, a groundswell of this uprising of common sense, where we say, not only have we contributed, not only are these myths and stereotypes wrong, they're insulting, and when you say that to somebody in a conversation, in a calm, dispassionate conversation, my life experience is that maybe the initial reaction is to gaslight me or to disagree with me, but a person does walk away and reflect, because that's our natural innate morality. And we will say, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I've been looking at this. Maybe I've been reading the wrong newspapers. These people seem to be all right. And we work together, and we're fine, and we want the same things for our kids. So maybe these narratives shouldn't be so influential in our lives.
So I wonder, is there any documentation, anything written about the fact that many were refused access to French schools at the time? In various other research,
right,
I was told that Quebec had its responsibility, that indeed it did create a wrong in refusing 15 years prior the St. Leonard crises, that it did refuse access to many immigrant children, and that was a wrong.
Right.
I never came across it. The person that actually delivered that information is very credible, but I never came across that in any books or any literature. Do you know of any? Okay,
well, I think that there's something that needs to be said as well and considered. And one of the things that needs to be considered is the time frame that we're talking about. If you consider the 1950s and 60s, you also need to consider that this was a period of time when people did not have very much inhibition to express prejudicial comments and engage in discriminatory practices. there was no human rights legislation in force in Quebec, in Canada, and there was no culture really of respecting individual rights. You have to understand that although and therefore, and during this time period, lest we forget that the Jim Crow laws of the southern states were very much in effect. There was a high degree of discrimination going on. The civil rights movement was just getting started by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And why am I saying that? So it was very natural for people to just say, you're Italian, you can't be here. I recall my generation, my parents' generation, telling me there were instances of signs being placed on homes for rent that said, à louer, pas de chien, pas d'italien.
Yes.
That would be unheard of to post today. Also signs saying, we don't hire Italians. So there was a culture at that time that accepted that kind of behavior. And we had to wait until 1975 for Quebec to pass its first human rights legislation. And people don't realize that it was a unanimously passed act in 1975 that predates the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms that happened in 1982. So in that time period, people felt that they could say these things and act this way, and there was nothing illegal about it. It was socially acceptable, whether we like it or not. So when we today, in 2024, blame the government or these practices at the time, I do make an allowance for the fact that it was a different society. But it's not right to say, well, it was the church's fault, they influenced us too much and this is what we did. I think we need to say, as we say about civil rights for racialized persons and indigenous persons, or the residential schools that were going on at that time, it was wrong. It was wrong. We should have known better. And so therefore, that's a very important part of the tapestry of this story that's not really mentioned. In 1975, things started to change. It would have been illegal to do these kinds of things. Now, you ask, is there documentation? And my answer is, as far as I know, no studies have been done on this. But however, what I can say is that so much of our public policy is based on anecdotal observances and occurrences. And there comes a point when you cannot dismiss what occurred as anecdotal, random occurrences. Too many people have basically come forward to say, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, like the Me Too movement, okay? Like the Black Lives Matter movement. It starts with the anecdotes that add up to too many stories and really finally amount to a realization that this was a systemic practice. Now, I would welcome, just because we don't have any statistics now, it does not mean that there isn't data out there. For example, archives are kept of the schools that were run in the 50s and 60s. School commission resolutions and deliberations and minutes of school board meetings are out there. But more importantly, there are many living witnesses to what occurred. So I would welcome a study on this issue that would seek to quantify this phenomenon and to ask people to come forward and give their oral histories, get on record, and compile the people, names, occurrences, schools, where this happened. Also the living survivors. I've received many private messages from children of my generation who unfortunately have passed, but who have called me and said, my father told me that that's what happened to him, and that's why he sent me to English school. My grandfather told me about this. So there are plenty of people. So I do believe that some kind of quantification could be done, but that doesn't really undermine the validity of this experience, because too many people shared it. Too many people showed up last night for that meeting. Too many people sent me emails saying, sorry, I missed it, I was out of town. But yeah, it happened to me as well. And so that could be something that would be worth pursuing. But I think that could be pursued concurrently with the dialogue that I'm talking about. It could be part of the dialogue, but I don't think it's right for politicians to say we don't want to talk about this. That's completely the opposite of a democracy. A democracy isn't afraid of any conversation, and a democracy is not afraid of conversation, and a democracy doesn't tolerate violence for political reasons or anything else, or inappropriate language or inappropriate conversations, but a democracy welcomes dispassionate, fact-based conversations, and this is one I think we need to start having. There are other false narratives out there, and in the next 2 years, I think we need to engage in them as a community, and more than as a community, individually. And I think social media is really great and is changing the nature of how we advocate, because the gatekeepers are being eliminated. And there's more possibility, thanks to social media, for a direct conversation of the people with their elected representatives. We can cut out a lot of the middlemen that get it wrong, and we can speak directly to each other, a lot easier. And if media doesn't want us, if the traditional media, newspapers and so on, don't want to have this conversation, social media does. Mm-hmm. So we have a tremendous opportunity to get this alternate vision for our society out there. And yes, we can still engage in credible social science studies to get to the root of this issue.
We really went through it, all our questions, unless
Oh,
you feel you want to add anything else.
We
talked about your experience, where you were born, how you grew up, your experience of being, your recollection of being excluded, refused.
Yes. Oh, there's one other thing that I didn't say. So one of the things that I take issue with as well is that when the Italian-speaking community was basically rejected, what was happening, in fact, and what politicians failed to take ownership of, is they were engaged in a policy of imposed Anglicization. So basically they were telling us, don't come here, go over there. When you go over there, you're going to learn English. And at the time, it didn't seem to bother them. There was no linguistic imperative or reflection on what they were doing. And then I have to say, if you ask me, how was your school experience? I have to say that the public English Catholic school system treated me very well. We had a tremendous educational experience at that time. You have to understand, I'm part of the baby boomer generation. So I was accustomed to classrooms of 30 to 40 kids in a classroom. I saw myself in that classroom. Many of my classmates were Italian immigrant children. And we got the right messages from our teachers about the importance of education. We respected our teachers. We knew better not to contradict them and to learn. And we were there to learn, and we learned well. It was a great experience. When we went to high school, we learned that it was a good idea to go to university. And most of us did. And what I take from that, and what I don't understand, is why is the Francophone majority so surprised in the 1970s that we would want to continue to patronize those schools? Schools who accepted me for who I was, who didn't think I was too hard to teach, who empowered me. Why in the world would I not send my own children to that system instead of the system that rejected me and, quite frankly, only want me now for political purposes? It's only to respond to a political and demographic imperative that they were so anxious to get immigrants. We sort of felt a little used. Now, we understand how democracy works, and Parliament, our National Assembly, can pass these laws and force immigrants to go to French schools. We accepted that. Eventually, everybody did. There was a period of time where we had illegals but that was resolved by Claude Ryan, Minister Claude Ryan, in the 1980s. And now it's just taken as a given. And we have the first generation of Bill 101 students. We have a second generation, we'll have a third. But, you know, to go back to the genesis of this issue, why are we so surprised that in the 1970s, when you want to change the rules of the game, and that there's a reluctance, you know, to be forced into a system that you initially rejected us from. So I think what I take from that is that there needs to be bilateral empathy, and I think that that's been missing, that the Francophone majority should have been a little more sensitive to that game changing. And instead of that, we got immigrant blaming. And we got, well, you're not accepting the fact that, you know, we need to survive and you just got to do what we're telling you to do.
I have a question now that just popped in my how do you explain, and do you agree with, there are a lot of individuals of Italian descent or part of the Italian community involved in the education system back then and today as well,
right?
In the English
Yes.
education system. How do you explain that?
Well, I explain that as that was a welcome development as far as I'm concerned. And I think that when I started education, primary school, the vast majority of the teachers were Irish Catholic. And the English Catholic School Board, its genesis was the 19th century immigration wave from Ireland, the potato famine. And so a lot of teachers were Irish Catholic. As the years went along, that population sort of diminished, but it's still present. But a lot of Italians went into the teaching profession. And I think that they were drawn to the teaching profession because I think we acknowledge the importance of education, number one, and the mission of education, which is more than just teaching students subject and pedagogy but you know, responding to the whole student, and to if you want to go into a profession or a calling where you will impact on the lives of people, you know, teaching is it. Teaching is the place. So I think that a lot of the Italian community had a very positive educational experience in Quebec, and were drawn to that experience and wanted to impact, you know, the lives of students. The demographic changed over time, but I recall when I was in the 70s, we started to see young Italian dynamic teachers, you know, teaching us physics and history and coaching our football teams and soccer teams. And we looked up to them. They became our role models. And they were really impactful in our lives. And when we had reunions, they were there, you know, and said those were the best teaching years of their lives, the 70s and the 80s. And then things sort of changed. The population dwindled because of Bill 101. But many Italians were drawn to that profession, rightly so. And as I said, I have a niece and two daughters that are drawn to that profession because I think there's a desire to do something impactful with your life. And I think that few of us will remember the first accountant that worked for us, or the first banker, or you know, but many of us will remember that one or two teachers that took an interest in us, you know.
I have one tiny
Yeah,
question
sure.
left. You mentioned the illegals, and
Yes.
I'm just wondering, do you know anything about that time, about the illegals, and did you feel that that was a form of, like, what was that whole procedure about?
I think
How
that
could you explain that?
I explain the illegals as an act of civil disobedience. I think that what happened then was it was very hard for parents to be told that because of these new rules, the admissibility rules were not all very coherent, not all very logical. The first one being that admissibility to English schools was going to be based on your having gone to primary school. And there was a tradition a lot of parents were doing things like sending kids to primary school, grade school in French, and then switching them to English in high school, and then they would go on to university. Those kids would not be eligible to send their kids to English school. So I think what happened was that overnight the rules of the game changed. And it was a transition period that we got through peacefully and pretty well. And this also showed to me the nature of the teacher and the pedagogical mission. And a lot of the teachers at that time were fundamentally opposed to this, you know, that why could families not continue to send them here? They're happy here. So they turned a blind eye to the law and somehow generated documentation for these kids to get through grade school and then on to high school. But it was wrong because the law is the law. And as a lawyer, I respect the rule of law. And eventually, this needed to be dealt with. I forget what the numbers were, but eventually an amnesty was declared, and they were normalized. And you know, the page turned, and we accepted those rules of the game. But it was part of that, I think, transition period. And you know, eventually they conformed. And you have to also know that one of the motivating factors of the language issue, yes, there was a concern about too many immigrant kids going to English schools. The people that were most concerned about that were teachers, because they saw the enrollment numbers dwindling in the French schools and the enrollment numbers going up in English schools. So there were more Anglophone, English-speaking teachers that were getting jobs. So job concerns played a big role in the language debate. Yes, there was a question of the continued presence of the French language or the weakening of the French language, but the frontline people involved in that were teachers because they received the kids. And what's more important in terms of socialization than the schools? So there was a huge concern about you know, lower enrollments causing lower school attendance, causing fewer job opportunities. And of course, Bill 101 redressed that, and the opposite started to happen. English teachers started to be put on availability lists, not being hired. The numbers switched. Schools were closed. The English-speaking population dwindled. Also, even parents with eligibility started to patronize French schools, and that was a legitimate choice. We can't blame them, or a parent is going to do what they feel is right for their kids. So the illegals were transitional collateral damage in this larger story. But eventually, Italian immigration dwindled. I mean, by the end of the 70s, few Italians were immigrating to Canada. But a different wave happened. There was a Greek wave. There was a Portuguese wave of immigration. And then immigrations coming from the Arab world, immigration coming from Africa, completely Haiti, Latinos from Central America. It changed. And when these people came, they came to this new society, the post-1977 society, and that was their normal. They made their way, their linguistic path here, but a good many of them learned English. I recall the year 1967 very well. That was our centennial celebration. We had Expo 67 was hosted in Montreal. Some 50 million people from all over the world attended Expo 67. I recall visiting Expo 67. I recall living in Montreal at that time. There was a palpable energy about Montreal in 1967. You felt that you were living in what was going to become an international powerhouse because of everything we had going for us at that time. And we had it all then. We still have it now. We had it all then. We had the largest province in Canada, abundant natural resources, stellar institutions of higher learning, universities that compete on the world, and a talented workforce, educated workforce, bilingual and multilingual workforce that could fetch work anywhere in the world and bring it here and sell anything to the whole world because of this linguistic proficiencies that we had. Montreal was the largest city in Canada, and it was home to basically all head offices that did international trade. That was our start point. And look at where we are now. And, you know, I could be called all kinds of names for saying this, but I'm convinced that the politics of language and identity cost us a lot. And whether we like it or not, we lost ground to the province of Ontario. We're still losing ground to the province of Ontario. Toronto took off and never looked back from Montreal. So instead of rivaling New York, we basically have been trailing Toronto in their rearview mirror. We continue to be the have-not province of Confederation, relying on federal transfer payments to make ends meet in terms of being able to give public services to our electorate. As a Quebecer, I'm entitled to be a little bit outraged about that. And I think it's time that we start talking to each other about what is the vision that we have for Montreal, the real vision for Montreal and for Quebec. Is this where we should be? And why are we stuck in this compromised economy? And that's what we're living in. We are living in a very compromised economy. And we're now at the point where Montreal is referred to as this charming city that has terrific bagels and smoked meat, and is a great place for festivals. But we're capable of more than that. We are the hub and could become a huge hub for all of the growth industries like IT, artificial intelligence, gaming, pharma, aerospace. These are all areas that require a level of proficiency in the English language, because English is the international language of business. So one of my disappointments is that I fundamentally believe that our politics of language and identity are compromising our opportunities, and that accounts for the brain drain that we have had for too long, and that we're at risk right now of recreating. So we need to avoid the mistakes of the past. And I think we need to engage in a conversation that says we can have a dual track approach to language. And that dual track approach is we all agree that it's important and it's part of who we are. I have never had a desire to live in a unilingually English jurisdiction. In the 40 years when all of this has been going on, it never once crossed my mind to leave. So what does that tell the majority, the Francophone majority, that I love Quebec? And so I think the dual approach is that trust us to be your allies. Bilingualism is not a threat to the French language. It enhances the French language. It empowers people to have more opportunities. But at the same time, let's respect human rights. Let's have a dual track where we say, we will celebrate diversity and inclusion and individual human rights, and we will make them compatible and promote the French language in a harmonious manner. And we will have a more prosperous society. I'm convinced of that societies that are more inclusive and diverse generate more prosperous economies. And that means more opportunities for all of us, all of our children, French-speaking and English-speaking. That's what I forgot to say.
Thank you for that.